Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tracy Johnson. I'm the Dean of Life Sciences at UCLA. And I wanted to mention before we start a few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded, so both the chat and the Q&A functions have been disabled. So thank you very much for submitting your questions in advance. I started my new role as Dean about a month ago, and I am really honored to be able to lead this division and to build on this foundation of excellence that was created by my predecessor, Dr. Victoria Sork. I've been a faculty member here at UCLA in life sciences since 2013, and my disciplinary home is in the Department of Molecular Cell and Developmental Biology. My research has been focused on studying various aspects of gene regulation, particularly the processes of RNA splicing and chromatin modification and the intersection of a number of different molecular events that take place in the nucleus. But one of the most exciting aspects of my job has been that I've been able to fully envelop myself in amazing research carried out by life sciences faculty, students, and staff. And these are in many cases research areas that, at least on the surface, are quite different from my primary area of focus, which has been such a delight. An example of this is what you're going to hear about today. So during my tenure as Dean, I look forward to being able to really highlight the incredible research and the fantastic accomplishments in all of the departments in life sciences. Today, I'd like to welcome you to a special virtual event in our Psychology Presents series, Understanding Adolescence from Neurons to Cultures. This seminar series, hosted by the Department of Psychology, is intended to spark new conversations about topics including everything from understanding racism and anxiety, depression, addiction, bullying, stress, all types of facets of mental health. Today's topic is going to be focused on the adolescent brain and brain development and behavior and adolescent mental health in a cultural context. So I'm excited for you to get to hear from two of our experts in this field. We are really honored to have faculty such as the two you're going to hear from today. I'm pleased first to introduce to you the chair of this amazing department, the distinguished professor, Annette Stanton. In addition to her appointment in the Department of Psychology, Dr. Stanton is also a professor of psychiatry and in biobehavioral sciences. She's a member of our Johnson Comprehensive Cancer Center, and she's a scientist in the UCLA Cousin Center for Psychoneuroimmunology. Dr. Stanton's research focuses on understanding what helps or what hinders people who are experiencing profound stressors such as cancer, and then taking these findings and translating them into approaches to promote their well-being and health. So as you can see, the questions that we ask here in UCLA, particularly in psychology, span a wide range of critical questions and topics that are of interest broadly. So I'd like for you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Annette Stanton.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for your introduction, Dean Johnson. We are delighted that you are our new dean, and we thank you for joining us tonight. And I'm, as Dean Johnson said, I have the honor of chairing the UCLA Department of Psychology, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening. Our alumni, I know many of you are here, our faculty and staff, and friends of UCLA Psychology. We welcome you all, and we really use this Psychology Presents as a vehicle for bringing our research to you. Let me tell you a little bit about the department. Here in the department, we have some of the world's foremost experts in psychology and neuroscience. They're conducting highly innovative and impactful research in behavioral neuroscience, learning, and cognitive, clinical, developmental, health, quantitative, and social psychology. By a number of metrics, we are a leading department of psychology in the nation and the world. UCLA Psychology is home to the #1 clinical psychology program, the #4 social psychology program, the #5 behavioral neuroscience program, and the #12 cognitive psychology program, according to News and World Report. We're also educating new generations. Unfortunately, right now, remotely, but we can't wait to be back in the classroom. with our nearly 4,000 undergraduates who are enrolled in our 3 psychology majors. And then our highly competitive Ph.D. program fosters tomorrow's leaders in research, teaching, and public service. We also serve the community. In addition to translating our research into action to enhance well-being and health, the Department of Psychology operates a psychology clinic that provides low-fee therapy and assessment to adults, children, couples, and families. And we have an infant development program, which provides high-quality childcare to infants and toddlers of faculty, staff, and students. Unfortunately, we can't take your questions live tonight because there are so many of you, which we're delighted about. And I want to thank all of you who submitted your questions in advance, and we'll try to get to them. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the first of 2 psychology faculty who will be talking with us this evening. First, Dr. Adriana Galván. Dr. Galván is a professor of psychology whose expertise is in adolescent brain development. In addition, just this past summer, Dr. Galván was appointed UCLA's Dean of Undergraduate Education. Her research examines how changes in brain maturation relate to adolescent behavior and decision-making, and the role it plays in risk-taking behaviors such as substance use. A primary goal of her lab is understanding adolescent behavior by using neuroimaging methods, as you'll see, to study the changing adolescent brain, including how stress, sleep, puberty, and social relationships affect how adolescents make choices. Dr. Galván earned a BA from Barnard College at Columbia and a PhD in neuroscience from Cornell. And then she spent 2 years here at UCLA as a postdoctoral scholar before joining our faculty in 2008. Welcome, Dr. Galván. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Stanton. I'm really excited to be here. So am I going to get my slides now? Great, thank you. Okay, great. So as Annette mentioned, my research area is in adolescent brain development and how that relates to all the fantastic changes we see during this period of life. But I thought I would start by providing an overview or a definition about what we mean when we say adolescence. Adolescence is roughly between the ages of 10 and 25. It's a period of remarkable growth, development, and learning. Second only to the first few years of life, when we know that babies undergo a lot of changes physically and biologically and emotionally. That's also true of the adolescent period. And as you'll see on this slide, adolescence encompasses a lot of different stages, a lot of different ages. There's early adolescence, mid-adolescence, all the way up through young adulthood. And the reason this is important to highlight is that not all adolescents, of course, are the same, and not every age or every period of adolescence is the same. So what may apply to an 11-year-old, for example, someone who is just beginning the onset of puberty and the biological and physical changes that accompany it, will be different from someone who's 18 or 19, who's beginning to transition into adulthood. And so all of these different ages come with some remarkable opportunities for growth and development. Next slide, please. So during adolescence, there are a lot of changes. There are remarkable increases in the need to be autonomous, to be independent from caregivers and other mentors. There's a lot of identity formation during this time. And what's fantastic about the adolescent brain is that the changes in the brain are well suited to these very key, very normal developmental tasks. This picture that you're looking at is a representation of all the different connections that happen during adolescence. It's not to say that the brain isn't developing and maturing before adolescence, but during this time is when the brain refines itself. It pays attention to what is important in that individual's environment, and this and can react to it. And this notion is referred to in the neuroscience literature as brain plasticity. And that means the phenomenon of heightened sensitivity to experiences. And adolescents are really good at incorporating the environment and responding to it. So someone who is in an enriched environment their brain will respond to that by forming new connections and new synapses. Next slide, please. And I think one of the reasons all of us are here today and why one of the main interests of mine in my research is how adolescents or how society can help adolescents thrive, knowing what we know about the changes that occur during this time. Slide, or, okay. And one thing we can do is to support adolescents' drive, very natural drive to be purposeful, to be self-reliant, to be socially engaged. There are many examples, particularly in this moment in our nation's history, of adolescents really stepping up and being impassioned leaders of causes that they believe in. And as a society, we can do better to support that, to think about adolescence as a very important time and a time for a lot of opportunity for change and for not just individual change, but for enacting change in the society. Next. To do this, we need to provide systems that promote young people's identity, their sense of meaning, and their confidence. And schools and other systems that young people come into contact with do a pretty good job of doing this, but I think that we can do better in ways that support all adolescents. As I mentioned before, not all adolescents undergo the same timeline in terms of when they undergo puberty, for example. Not all adolescents have the same rearing experience or educational experience. And so providing systems that help all adolescents thrive is really an important goal. Next. And just to underscore that point, we need to acknowledge and celebrate all the diverse experiences. And here I mean diversity really broadly defined. So not just in terms of ethnically or socioeconomically, but in terms of what adolescents gravitate towards. What are their interests? How do they interact with social media? I get a lot of questions from parents and caregivers about how adolescents interact with social media and how that's impacting their brain. But again, there's not one size fits all in that regard either. And we can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. Next. Key to helping adolescents thrive is the importance of social relationships. Many of you may have heard before about the social brain. And this refers to particular brain regions that undergo substantial maturation during the adolescent years that support all types of cognitive and social processes. So it's no coincidence that adolescents seem to gravitate towards their peers after they hit puberty. And one reason for that is that the brain has developed in a way that will motivate them to seek out really meaningful social relationships, want to establish social bonds. But it's important to remember that even though they're making new friends on the soccer team or in extracurricular activities, that family remains just as important to adolescents. There's a lot of emerging research coming out of various labs. One of them is Eva Telzer, who was a graduate of the UCLA psychology program, showing that parents and mentors and caregivers really still matter to adolescents, even if it doesn't always seem that way. They really care about the opinions of those whose opinion they really value. So I think I will stop there and leave more time for my colleague Annette to make her remarks, and then we can have a conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Adriana. I'm a parent of two former adolescents, and I wish I had known about many of your findings as I worked on raising them. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Anna Lau. Dr. Lau is a clinical psychological scientist and professor of psychology and of Asian American studies. Her research addresses three broad areas related to the mental health of culturally diverse youth. First, she focuses on identifying risk and protective factors for the development of youth's emotional and behavioral problems in cultural context. Her second area is the implementation of evidence-based treatments for low-income ethnic minority youth and families in community mental health agencies. Finally, her lab developed strategies for reducing racial and ethnic disparities in youth mental health care with a focus on school-based prevention and intervention. Dr. Lau is a double Bruin, earning both her master's and her Ph.D. in clinical psychology, and she joined our faculty in 2003. Dr. Lau has many roles, and she's currently the Vice Chair of Graduate Studies in the Department of Psychology. And she's also chaired the Academic Senate Committee on Undergraduate Admissions and Relations. She's a member of the Asian American Studies Center Faculty Advisory Committee, and she co-chairs the Life Sciences Diversity Advisory Committee. Take it away, Dr. Lau.
Thank you, Professor Stanton, for the introduction, and to everyone for joining us today. As Annette described, my research spans across what we might call the translational pipeline of psychological science to inform treatment for adolescents across diverse cultural groups. So I take a lot of pleasure in being a clinical psychologist, and that allows me to study mental health problems as well as test out strategies for helping youth in the community. So can I get the first slide, please? Thank you. So in this pipeline, we might consider that we have three types of research. So the first type being preclinical research, and this is where we do observational studies that help us to identify what we call mutable risk and protective factors. So changeable risk and protective factors that elevate or reduce risk for mental health problems in adolescents. And these studies help us to design or select interventions that can target modifiable risk and protective factors. And then we have intervention research, where here the gold standard is to use randomized controlled trials to establish the effectiveness of interventions for adolescents. And then, as Dr. Stanton described, I have an interest in implementation research. So once we have identified those interventions that are shown in our experiments to be effective, we know that there are many challenges that can prevent them from being used in community settings that treat teens. So the reach and sustained use of our evidence-based treatments can be really low, and it's estimated sadly, that it takes 17 years for only 14% of research interventions to impact our routine care. And implementation research aims to reduce this science to practice gap by identifying strategies that help bring effective treatments to community settings to improve health at the population level. And I won't say too much more about this topic, except that I think this is a really important avenue to reduce mental health care inequities. Can I have the next slide? So a big wrinkle in this translational pipeline is that it's important to understand sources of diversity across these problems. So in preclinical research, oh, actually, I think we've skipped one. Can you go back to the last slide? Slide 2, thank you. So in preclinical research, we know that there is variable exposure to different types of risk factors among teens across racial ethnic groups. And this is shaped by social inequities and structural racism, for example. And potentially also there are different protective factors that are important in different cultural groups to attend to. And so this means that our treatments and interventions can really be tailored or optimized to address risk and protective factors that are most important for specific cultural groups who might be showing a mental health need. And in the intervention phase of research, one challenge that we have is that our intervention studies and randomized trials have historically not been very inclusive of youth from diverse cultural groups. So we don't always have full confidence in how our interventions generalize. But the good news is that most available research that we have that is inclusive suggests that our intervention effects tend to extend to ethnic minority youth, but we do have some big problems in engaging diverse communities and diverse adolescents in our treatments. They tend to enter care and studies at lower rates and drop out earlier from treatment. And so many people are concerned about, who exactly is represented in the evidence that underlies evidence-based treatments. So next slide, please. So some of my research is focused on what to do about cultural differences and adolescents' risk for depression and anxiety. And how can we accommodate or address different needs of cultural groups in our interventions? So one example of this kind of tension has to do with translating our findings on cultural diversity in emotion regulation. We know that emotion suppression, so purposely reducing our expression of our feelings and avoiding our feelings, appears to be a modifiable risk factor for anxiety and mood problems in a lot of research in the US. And we all know Freud, and Freud said that unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. And in research with predominantly white samples, there's pretty good data that emotion suppression leads to later more interpersonal problems, lower feelings of social support, and more anxiety and depression symptoms. And we know that emotion expression is valued in cultures like American culture that's independent oriented, and that aligns with the goals of asserting yourself and getting your needs for support met. But our research in Asian American samples suggests that Asian American adolescents and teens and kids tend to rely much more on emotion suppression to cope with stress. And it's thought that this is congruent with cultural values around interdependence, where people are encouraged to prioritize the group or the family over themselves, and where people have concerns about burdening other people with their emotions. And actually, we find that the negative effects of emotion suppression coping are weaker or not at all apparent among Asian American teens, and often they do not seem to develop depressive symptoms as a result. And in the lab, Asian Americans seem pretty skilled at suppressing negative emotion. They appear to do it with less effort and with less physiological arousal. But some of our evidence-based interventions that are targeting reduction, that are intended to reduce depression and anxiety, work by getting teens to stop suppressing their emotions and to improve healthy expression of feelings. So the question becomes whether these same interventions make sense for Asian American teens for whom emotion suppression does not seem to be as critical a risk factor. Next slide. So we've looked at these interventions in randomized controlled trials with inclusive samples, and one such intervention we looked at is mindfulness intervention. And mindfulness works by helping people focus their attention on the present moment while acknowledging and accepting their emotions and thoughts and bodily sensations without judgment. And mindfulness reduces emotion suppression and avoidance of emotion. And it involves things like breathing, meditation, body scans, observing your thoughts and feelings, and working on practicing kindness to yourself. And the good news is that in multiple trials that we've run now that have included Asian American and Latinx youth, we've shown that the effects of mindfulness are even larger than in previous trials with predominantly white samples of teens. And reductions in anxiety and depression appear to be arrived at by reducing emotion suppression. So how is it that our preclinical research might show a risk factor to not be so risky for a cultural group, but then when we target that as a mechanism in intervention, we get the desired outcome? And we think it might be a question of who needs intervention. So emotion suppression might be culturally congruent and not generate problems for everyone in a particular cultural group. But when we identify youth who are struggling with elevated depression and anxiety in those groups, teens do seem to benefit. So that's good news. But we've also looked at interventions that focus on communication skills that help teens to express emotion, and especially in relationships in order to get support and reduce conflict. And actually in one of our trials, we've shown that we don't have as much success reducing depression and anxiety in a trial with significant numbers of Asian American teens and teens from immigrant families. And here our analysis suggests that teens from those groups were reluctant to try and practice and use those communication strategies such as I statements. And they feared that these skills wouldn't be well received by others, especially their parents. So that example highlights that cultural differences in values might be really important to consider when we roll out interventions in the community, and that we do probably really need to attend to those differences. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Lau. It's really inspiring how you go out into the community and do your research beyond just the lab. Now, I'd like to turn to questions, and a number of the questions that were submitted beforehand really centered on parents who have adolescents or teachers who are working with adolescents. And a question that we might start out with is, how can we understand the large swings in emotions that you sometimes get in adolescence? Sometimes intense anger, sometimes feeling despondent, and how can parents respond, especially if that emotion is directed toward the parents? What does your research, what do your findings say about that? Dr. Galván, do you want to begin?
Sure. The first thing I'll say is that it's very normal. I mean, I think it's hard to accept that in the moment when it feels so personal, but it's an absolutely normal part of development. And one thing I didn't say in my remarks is that the brain develops, different parts of the brain develop at different rates. And probably everyone has heard the idea that the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain, that helps you think about the future and think about your behavior, develops last. And that's certainly true. But there's also a lot of change in emotion-related regions that help you respond to the world, respond emotionally. And those regions are really active during adolescence, and they serve a purpose. They serve a purpose of helping adolescents feel motivated. They serve a purpose of expressing emotion the way Dr. Lau was talking about. And so I think when that's happening, it's important to remember that it's normal. It's also important to remember that this isn't the first time, right? I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of change in the brain and in biology in the first few years of life. And that's similar to adolescence, when there's a lot of change in emotions, similar to when kids were younger. But Anna, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and particularly in cultural context, Anna, I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say.
Well, the second part of your question had to do with how do parents respond when they are the target of that kind of emotional energy, let's call it. And that's it, especially right now when we're all in such close quarters and stress is high. I think that's a big issue. And it is hard to remain empathic, right? And it's hard to respond with empathy and listen to kind of what's underneath that anger and intense emotion when your teen might be coming at you. So what I might say about it is that, it's going to be natural in these times to also react with a lot of emotion. And I think it's good to just aim for good enough balance, right? So having those moments where you are able to break through and kind of connect with what might be going on underneath the anger, and listening for an opening to express empathy about whatever the stress is. But there are going to be other times where you're going to just have to say, it's not appropriate to speak to me that way. And when you're able to kind of calm down and, kind of communicate with me appropriately, I'm happy to listen. So I think, we're all doing our best in these times. I think also parents need to practice some self-care if there's a lot of that going on. So take yourself a time out when you need that, so that you can increase the chances that you're going to be able to respond with some empathy.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to have some reflective moments, not in the moment, right? To have it, to take some space from the event or the eruption or whatever it is, to decompress about it when both parties are feeling a little bit calmer.
You know, that connects with you. You mentioned having some empathy for your adolescent who's going through this. But another question from our audience had to do with how do we help adolescents have empathy toward others, especially others who are different from them. We see many divides in the country today. We see a lot of action to decrease racial injustice. How can we think about empathy and promoting empathy in adolescence?
I think, you know, maybe I'll take a stab at this first, Anna, but one way is to model the empathy. I think that from the time that our kids are young and younger than adolescents, they really take our cues. And during adolescence, they're paying particular attention to the way we respond to the social world. And so modeling that empathy, even if we may disagree with whomever is in the news or something like that, trying to take the perspective of the other is something that they will pick up on and hopefully emulate themselves. But Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely 100%. I think that kids learn a lot more from what they see us do rather than what we tell them to do. And I'll just say that this is an area that I think that touches on these cultural differences in how parents approach this problem. So one area of research that shows big cultural differences that have been kind of judged pretty negatively is in some cultures, parents rely a lot more on what is in psychological research called psychological control. And this is using strategies like shaming or inducing guilt in kids for when they transgress or do something wrong. And you know, there's a lot of research that suggests that that's a really unhealthy thing for parents to do, particularly in an independence-oriented Western culture. You don't want to rely on shaming that much. But there's some versions of that some distillation of that actually parents do across cultures that could be really helpful. And that is from the time children are young, it's okay for parents also to express to their children how their behavior makes them feel, how their behavior makes other people feel. And that's an early precursor to them being able to perspective take themselves. And so I think it's also very fine to be real in a conversation with an adolescent about the impact of the adolescent's behavior or thoughts or, you know, statements on the parent themselves. So rather than just reacting in anger, kind of, you know, saying, going back to the conversation we had before, like, you know, spelling out, you know, promoting that teen's awareness of how their behavior impacts, you know, the parent. And I think that can be carried through in a lot of other ways to sort of scaffold that perspective taking.
Thank you. We had questions from teachers and from parents about engaging and learning in a remote environment, and adolescents in particular. Whether the adolescent is sitting at home or maybe with a small pod of other adolescents, whether the parent is trying to engage the child in education or the teacher is trying to engage the child. What does your research, how does your research bear on that kind of question of engagement in remote learning?
Well, I don't think many of us have that specific data, but I think we can kind of fall back on what effective parenting looks like in different contexts. And, you know, there's just a lot of evidence that good monitoring, close monitoring of what your child or adolescent is doing is really important. You can't really intervene if you don't know kind of what's going on. So, and we know that for a lot of behaviors, that parents might not think it's effective for them to state a rule or have a household rule, but actually the research is very, very clear. If parents, have household rules about things like drinking alcohol or whatever it is, or attending class and not sleeping through class, it's important to state those rules and expectations, and then to have something in place to be able to monitor, adherence to those rules. And then hopefully there's bandwidth or time to, kind of reward when a teen is engaged and kind of meeting all those expectations, even when it's not the number one thing they'd rather do.
Yeah. And I think to stay engaged, it's very simple, but you need to be engaged. And to the extent that it's possible, being engaged with keeping the video on, keeping the mute off. And of course, some teachers ask the mute to come off or, be turned off because of the noise. But those things that seem trivial really make a difference in how engaged somebody is. There was this great section this weekend in the New York Times on learning, and a lot of anecdotal quotes from both students and teachers saying that one student said, when I turn off my video and my mute, it's equivalent to being in the back of the room slouching and not really paying attention. As opposed to when I turn it on and I'm responding and my video's on and everyone can see what I'm doing, I'm much more likely to respond to questions and to ask questions. And so I think those things are really important to maintain attention in the classroom setting.
And I'll just add the other thing that I think is happening is that, routines are so different now. And instead of getting up, getting dressed, grooming, having breakfast, and all those things that happen, I think some kids are just rolling out of bed and flipping on the Zoom, and that's the first thing that they're doing. So they're not doing all those other things that help them switch into a mode of learning. So you might not be able to control how engaged they are in front of the Zoom, but you sure can ask and expect someone to get up and get dressed, have a bite to eat, and be kind of ready to learn in that respect.
Yeah.
Well, and that gets back to, so Professor Lau, you were talking about having rules and that the importance of consistent rules and reward for when the rules are adhered to. What happens when an adolescent just doesn't adhere to the rules, and it can sort of become a battle? And I'm also wondering, Dr. Galván, about how do you help adolescents make those kind of decisions? Okay, I'm going to, here's a family rule about alcohol, let's say, or about having breakfast before I get onto Zoom. What if the adolescent says, no, what's next?
Yeah. I think in part engage them in the rule planning. And this is something that is really important because I think I mentioned that one of the developmental tasks or milestones of adolescence is to start to seek out autonomy and independence. And certainly, if you don't want alcohol in your house, you don't want alcohol in your house, and you're not going to negotiate around that. But to think about the root cause or request is about establishing some agency and making some own rules, some health-related rules. And so engaging them on that level is really important. So, I hear that you're not interested in eating breakfast every day, or I see that. How can we work around that? Maybe you'll have a snack at your first break or something like that, so that there's some negotiation that's reasonable for both parent and caregiver and adolescent. The research is really clear that in many cases, family conflict is really tied to exacerbation of any mental health issues that adolescents may be experiencing. So it's not to say that conflict should be avoided, because conflict is very normal, especially at this age, but certainly ways to think about how a problem can be solved without conflict is important. Anna, but what were you going to say? I think the question was directed at you, and I just jumped in.
No, that was such a great answer. You're really a clinician at heart, I think.
I know, I wish I was.
No, I would just add to that, teens and kids comply more to rules and expectations when they're invested in the relationship with the person who's making, is making the rules. So I think the collaboration and the partnership that Adriana talked about is really important. But, I think look to ways to promote closeness with your adolescent, so that they are, they see you as, kind of a rewarding stimulus and not just, disciplinarian. So sometimes, some investment in some of the more positive shared activities and can really pay off in terms of, kind of compliance and following, things, expectations.
And that relates to, I guess, the importance of working to keep family life alive when the adolescent may really prefer or say they only want to really see their friends, and you're sort of chopped liver. What can one do to keep the family life really alive? And Adriana, I'm thinking you're going to say something about choice, but giving them choice. But can you expand on that?
Certainly choice, so that the parent isn't the only person making the decisions, but also coming back to Anna's point about expectations. So we expect that we're going to have dinner together, maybe not every night, but certain nights a week, this is our time together. We expect, and setting expectations about, I want to know who you are as a person. I know I've been invested in you since you were born, and I still care about what your thoughts are and how your day went. And I think that's really important, but also giving them some opportunity to provide input on how that time should be spent. Maybe it's not around a dinner table. Maybe it's, outside or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. I would just encourage, we have a lot of interventions in clinical psychology that teach parents how to play with their young children. And some of those, because that tends to be the foundation for a lot of our parenting interventions, is to promote that positive interaction. And for teens, it really doesn't change that much. One of the main tenets in play is to really follow your child's lead. And same to an adolescence, really showing interest in what your teen is doing, what they like, asked to play along if they're into whatever it is these days, Among Us or whatever.
You say the same thing.
Hey, and I think actually that folks are finding now in these COVID times that, there actually is kind of more time together that can be spent in play and developing closeness.
Another question from the audience: How important is it to have a consistent mentor during adolescence? And do we think about parents as mentors, or do we think about bringing others in as potential mentors?
I think mentors are so important. And here again, the research is clear about the importance of mentoring, not just for kids who otherwise maybe don't have a great relationship with their parents, but for all kids. And establishing that mentoring even before adolescence, I think, is really important. It could be a family member, it could be an aunt, an uncle, an after school educator. Because sometimes there are going to be things that maybe the adolescent doesn't want to share with the parent, and having a trusted place and space to express those questions or ideas is really important. And I think mentoring is important throughout life. I mean, even after you're a professional and you've gone to college and everything like that, I think it's important to have people you can really rely on.
And I absolutely agree. And I just want to give a shout out to any teachers who are here attending this event. I just hear time and again in our qualitative research again how important teachers are in the lives of adolescents, and and small interactions that you might have just thought were just another day in your life of being a teacher, extending kindness and showing caring, that 100% is a really protective, formative experience for adolescents.
Adriana, I know some of your research has been on adolescent sleep and changing sleep patterns and how sleep functions in adolescence. And can you talk a little bit about that research?
I can talk a lot about it, but I only have a few minutes. But sleep is so important. I am so glad you brought that up. I think, I don't think I know from the research that sleep continues to be important even beyond the early, even the early, baby years and early childhood years. And historically, there's been a lot of attention on getting kids to sleep when they're young, and parents really want them to do that. But it remains just as important during adolescence, when we know that all of that brain development that I talked about really relies on healthy sleep. And there are very normative biological and psychosocial reasons why adolescents start to sleep less, including needing to get up earlier to go to school, or being on the screen late night. But also there are biological reasons. So the brain is actually changing in how it responds to daylight, and when it wants to go to bed and things like that. But it's really important to keep consistency in sleep habits. And coming back to something Anna said earlier about expectations, I think sleep is one of those places where we can continue to have expectations. And research shows that even though sleep is one of those things where parents start to give a little bit more autonomy, because it's kind of an easy thing to give autonomy on, those adolescents whose parents continue to enforce a consistent bedtime or bedtime range do get better sleep and fare better in terms of their emotion regulation, their ability to pay attention in school, and things that really matter during adolescence.
And much of your research really shows us how important context is, and the cultural context as important. And I'm wondering, you both talked about the importance of, it's not one size fits all. And so for teachers who are working, for example, in very diverse classrooms with diverse student backgrounds, how can somebody who's working with a group of adolescents also honor the differences among the students?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that we're all, in this moment becoming much more aware of how we as a society attend to and embrace differences. And we know that one sort of way of talking about differences is unhelpful, and that's to sort of take a colorblind approach, right? Like, we're all the same, we're all humans, and that really can sort of undermine a feeling of belonging among a diverse group of, say, a classroom. And instead, it's really important to have like an embracing differences approach. But it is challenging to know how to do that, especially if you're an educator who just really doesn't know that much about all the different communities that your students might come from. So I think it's a really nice kind of concept that people are talking a lot about now, is cultural humility, sort of just putting it out there that you don't know, and you're really interested in learning about people's beliefs, values, and traditions that are probably and potentially different from one's own. So that means not making assumptions about someone's values or beliefs based on their appearance or however you code their race, ethnicity, or culture, but to really kind of authentically approach with interest discussions about difference.
And Adriana, that question could go to you too, in terms of you see diverse brains, and you are trying to establish sort of more general principles. But what does your research say about diversity?
Yeah, this is actually an area that's not gotten as much attention in neuroscience that it needs to, because I think it's important to think about diverse brains, not so much as, all members of one ethnic group are going to look this way in terms of their brain development, but really coming back to the experience they may have had up until adolescence and through adolescence will impact their brain development.
Great. And now I'd like to turn to sort of a final question for both of you, and that is, I would like to know how your research findings have influenced the role you have at UCLA. And so, Adriana, you're our new Dean of Undergraduate Studies. What does your research tell you? How does your research guide you in thinking about undergraduates at UCLA?
That's a great question. I think that my research is actually what motivated me to want to be the Dean of Undergraduate Education. It's kind of a natural laboratory for me to study how young people transition into new spaces. And my research shows that, or my work is in my new role and new work is informed by my scientist hat, by thinking about the importance of thinking about the young person holistically. So we're not just thinking about academics and when they come to college, but really thinking about how their new relationships are changing, how they may have an uptick in some anxiety or depression, or or the opposite. They may explore new ways to express themselves or form new relationships. And so I guess the point is that thinking about them holistically is really important in how we serve students.
And by holistically, how does that apply in this time of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, because as we all know, our students are learning remotely and in very different spaces. And so while some students may have a very private space to take their courses and engage with their classes and their majors, other students are in a very chaotic environment. And so we're thinking carefully about how we can support all of our students because they're all in different environments. And there's been a lot written about how remote learning has exacerbated or really brought to light some inequities that had long existed on college campuses, but that maybe weren't as observable because everyone's kind of, in the same space. And so how we can serve students who are not in the same space is really crucial. So we've been thinking a lot about that in my division.
And have you found any approaches that you think have real promise or are being effective?
Yeah, well, I think just, we've done a lot of survey work here at UCLA to think about, to ask questions about how students are faring. And their responses have been really illuminating. So not just, there was a lot of assumptions that some students may not have access to reliable Wi-Fi, and that would be the biggest hurdle. But what we found is that coming back to the cultural differences in cultural environments, some students just simply are more pulled into their family dynamics when they're at home in ways that they're not when they're on campus. And so kind of messaging to families about the students' needs and the expectations that they will have as college students has been really important.
Thank you. And Anna, you are our Vice Chair of Graduate Studies in the department. Now, our graduate students are not adolescents, they are adults. But pardon? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering how your research and what you've learned, you bring that into your role as Vice Chair and working closely with graduate students.
I think, Adriana's slide, young adulthood, they're young adults. And, I think very similarly to Adriana when she was really talking about sort of holistic, thinking about students holistically and what they need to really thrive. And, our department, we are just blessed with such an incredible, talented group of PhD students, and they come to us already with extraordinary achievements. And so I think it's easy to think that they've got everything they need to thrive and become excellent scientists. But, I think we also know from not just our local data, but nationally, grad school is hard. Going to grad school is hard. There are a lot of challenges. It's financially difficult. It's a period of life where some of their peers who've taken other pathways into careers, have very different kind of means and resources, and yet, here they are pursuing, what they're passionate about studying. So I think it's really, how do we kind of continue to fuel their passion for what they want to study and help them achieve those goals, while also helping to kind of attend to and listen to what are those sources of stress, and where can we plug in resources and mentoring to support their work. We all want them to really succeed. I think that there's almost nothing as satisfying really as the mentoring that we do in our labs. So I think about that a lot, about how to support grad students holistically, and also they're coming to us with very different backgrounds and preparations, and so again, that one size does not fit all. Thinking about how to be both developmentally sensitive and sort of what they need in mentoring. But also thinking about what their background is, and where they might need more support, and where they're really well prepared to be pretty independent.
Thank you both, Professor Lau and Professor Galván, for sharing your research and its application with us today. And I really want to thank the audience. You gave us some great questions. We hope you enjoyed this third in our series and have learned something that you'll take with you. Because the webinar has been recorded, we're going to send you a post-event email with the link to the recording, and you can please feel free to share it with others. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for our next Psychology Presents event. Please keep an eye out for the invitation from UCLA Psychology for an event in the new year. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight, and everybody have a good evening.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.